Hello, whiskey enthusiasts. It's Brett, and as promised, I have brought you this week a review of the latest release from Old Forester, 1910. I was lucky enough to get what I believe was the first bottle of 1910 to come to my immediate area, and I have my buddy Jeremy Hallett at Hallett's Liquor in Independence, Kansas to thank for that, because he hooked me up the moment that he got some. I've been anxious to try this, as I'm sure some of the rest of you have. I can admit I'm a big fan of the Old Forester 1920, and I also love the 1870 batch also. This is the fourth in the line of year commemorative offerings from Old Forester, and I will let you seek out the reasons for the first three yourself. But I want to briefly tell you the idea behind 1910. In 1910, Old Forester had a fire. When they had the fire, they had just dumped a batch to get ready to bottle it. Because of the fire, they weren't able to go ahead and bottle it. And they were forced to pull the bourbon back out of the vats and put it back into barrels for I think it was like 9 or 10 months before they were able to go ahead and bottle it. So it essentially got double barreled. Old Forester says, and I got this directly at the distillery, says that they don't know the exact nature of the second barrels that were used. They don't know if they were new barrels, if they were charred, if they were toasted, if they were had previously used barrels, if they were the same barrels that they had just dumped. We don't really know. So the idea for Old Forester was to somewhat replicate what happened in 1910 with the fire. And this whiskey was put into a second set of barrels for a certain number of months before being bottled. It is significant to note that Old Forester does not use age statements on their bourbon. They bottle their bourbon specifically for the taste profile that they are looking for, not for a particular year. And that is why with whether it be the birthday bourbon, the 1920, the Statesman, any of them, you won't find age statements, but everything essentially ends up, for the most part, being between 4 and 7 years old, although there are a few that get older. And they're looking for a particular profile. And when a barrel reaches a certain flavor, that's when it is used on a given bottling, depending on what it is they're trying to achieve with that particular bottling. I recently, in October of 2018, visited the Old Forester Experience and took a tour in downtown Louisville. That's a very good tour. You should check it out if you've never been to it. They show you the way that they produce their barrels, because they have their own cooperage, and you get to actually see how the construction is done and actually see the flaming, charring of a barrel, which you don't get to see other places. So it's a neat experience. Their stills are also out in the open more than many other places, and you can actually see their column still, which is about 40 feet tall from the bottom all the way to the top. It's very pretty, and it's just a nice experience. Their tasting is very nice, and kudos to them for creating something that is fascinating for someone who already knows quite a bit about the whiskey experience and the production. So let's get right to the tasting and see what we get out of this 1910. This is bottled at 93 proof, which I will up front tell you is a little low for me on a bourbon. I have a tendency to like bourbons that are over 100 proof. Bourbons that I really like have a tendency to hit the sweet spot between 105 and 120. So there are not that many bourbons that impress me below 100 proof. The nose is rich on this compared to what I would expect from a 93 proof. I get some light fruitiness, a little bit of cherry, and a bubblegum note that is like super bubble, the little single. You've got some caramel, some creme brulee. There's very little spice on the nose. It's subtle. You get a little bit of nutmeg and some very, very delicate cinnamon. But the spice is very muted. This is more of a creamy, rich, buttery type of a nose. Now that I've, in my head, got this bubblegum note out of it, I can't bypass it. There we go. Now I'm getting just a hint of oak. And some of the more traditional vanilla. All in all, it's a nose that I like a lot. There's no heat in the nose. You're not going to get a lot of burn up your nostrils, even from the very beginning. I can say that I'm happy with the nose, especially given the proof. It's full flavored, so yeah, it's full. Now, this is my first drink of the day. I've had nothing else. Many times I will not give tasting notes on my first sip because often that first sip of the day you do get a lot of burn and you don't get a lot of flavor until the second sip. I will say that the bubblegum note, the sweetness of that is not as prominent in the palate as it was in the nose. I get a whole lot more of your traditional caramel and vanilla and a little bit of oakiness and spice, which is still pretty gentle. Now on that second note, I got more of the same, but the spice is a little bit more. Also that bubble gum note comes back a little bit and just a hint of some cherry. Now I'm getting some of the corn sweetness. And there's a little bit of a tannic drying note in the second half of the palate. I sometimes describe that as leathery. It definitely begins to give you a dry note towards the end of the palate. You've got that leathery and a little bit grassy note in there. Now moving on to the finish. The finish brings back that fruit, but also the spice rises in the finish. One thing that's different about this on the finish is that you do carry over a lot more fruit than a lot of bourbons. Personally, I tend to get a lot more wood and spice, especially clove and pepper, in the finish of a bourbon than I do in the palate or the nose. It's really in the finish that those things come out for me a lot. So consequently, finishes tend to sort of be mostly the same for me on bourbon. Not so much on other kinds of whiskey, but on bourbon they're pretty consistent. This one's different because I still get that get that bubblegum note coming back. It's very strong in the nose, and it comes back with a pretty good strength in the finish. It dissipates somewhat in the palate, and it is a lot more muted. What that translates to is a much sweeter finish than what I get on most bourbons. And I kind of like that. Sometimes with bourbon, especially those kinds of bourbons that have that drying, tannic, leathery note in the second half of the palate, I get almost a bitterness in the finish that is lying underneath the spices and the oak. In this, I don't really get that. The sweetness comes back alive in the finish, and that's very inviting. Now, conclusion. Overall, this is complex, it's sweet, and it's rich. It doesn't taste watery. I'm going to say right now that this is probably the best under 95 proof bourbon that I've had in a couple of years. Everything that I've had that I've liked better than this in bourbon has been 100 proof or higher. And I'm not sure, I don't think I own another bottle currently that is this proof or lower. I just don't get into those. I've tried them, I've had them, but if it's under 100 proof, I normally just don't stick with it. I buy a bottle, I drink it, I'm done with it, and I never buy it again. It's not a keeper for me. This is a keeper for me. I think this is a fine, fine bourbon, and how they got this much flavor out of it at the proof is a testament to the craftsmanship they put into it. I do think, based on what I'm getting out of it, I would say that the barrels used for the second casking of this whiskey, my guess is that they were toasted barrels, not charred. Or if they were charred, they were still toasted first. Because I think you've got a lot of resins and stuff that came to the surface. I don't know exactly how they did the treatment of the second set of barrels. So maybe they were, but I do believe they were toasted too, just based on that. If they weren't toasted, I'm at a little bit of a loss as to how they got some of the rich flavors out of them without it getting really, really woody, and it's not. It's not that oaky. It's finely balanced. I rate it highly. I would recommend almost anybody getting it. And in fact, this is going to go on my list of recommended bourbons for people who are just starting out. I have a tendency to start people out on lower proofed bourbons as they get their palate developed. And many of those will get left behind. Things like Weller Special Reserve or Larceny or other things like that that are fairly easy to drink. Many drinkers abandon those after the first bottle or two and move on to higher proofs or more spice or what have you. Unique position for this bottle is that I think it can be handled easily by a new drinker, but I think it can be also satisfying for an experienced bourbon drinker. And I think this is an absolutely excellent whiskey, especially for its price range. This bottle is going to cost you somewhere around $50, maybe a few dollars less, maybe a few dollars higher. I think I gave about $53 for this, and I don't know whether it's a little higher in my area than 50, but I know that a few people have gotten it a little bit lower. It may also be that the price is a little higher now because it's just coming out and it's harder to get. Regardless, it's an inexpensive whiskey for what it is. I highly recommend it. I'm going to give it a rating. And this is a rating not only on its flavor, although that's important, but also in its value, because in its price range, it's really hard to beat, I believe. I can't say enough how much I like this bourbon. And based on its value, price range, and its flavor, I'm going to rate this at a 91, which may be the highest rating I've ever given a bourbon, other than maybe William LaRue Weller. So there you have it. I hope that's useful for you. And I recommend anyone from a beginner to an experienced bourbon drinker at least give this a try, because I think it's a fine, fine whiskey. Regardless of what you do, go out and find you a whiskey you'll love.